Hey, hi, hello guys and welcome to the next video. Today we'll learn how to do integration testing for Spring WebClient that invokes external API, and we'll do it using WireMock and JUnit 5. As an example, we'll implement a simple logic responsible for querying GitHub API using coroutines. Nevertheless, I am pretty sure that you will be able to easily adjust this knowledge according to your needs and use that testing approach regardless of whether you are using web client, retrofit, Ktor HTTP client or any other HTTP client. Lastly, if you haven't subscribed yet, then don't forget to do it now. Regardless of what we are doing in our lives, it's good to have some strategy. But which one will be the best for testing web client? Short answer: there is no such a thing as the best testing strategy. And for the longer answer, let's take a look at the visualization of the testing pyramid first. This one is a typical testing pyramid that consists of unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end testing. The tests are ordered based on their scope and execution time. The closer we are to the top, the longer the tests take, but they also give us more confidence. Unit tests form the base, as they are quick to run and pinpoint specific code issues. Integration tests come next, validating the interactions between units. Lastly, end-to-end tests with a broader scope are placed at the top. So, long story short, end-to-end tests give us the most confidence, but we cannot fully rely on them because the feedback loop would take way too long. And this would affect the development process, so we usually make concessions and add more integration and unit tests. Okay, but finally, which of these two should we pick for web client? In my opinion, integration tests. Whenever we are talking about the logic responsible for querying external API, we need to make sure that we query the appropriate URL, the appropriate headers are sent and query parameters as well. Request response bodies are properly serialized and deserialized, and many more. And in my humble opinion, with unit testing, the amount of mocking would be so significant that I would personally question whether we need such a test at all. Moreover, in Spring we can write integration tests for web client with WireMock at almost no cost. But of course, this is my personal opinion and I will be happy to hear your thoughts about that in the comment section below. With that said, let's set up the API key we'll use to query the GitHub API. Technically, the endpoint we'll use does not require any token. However, for the learning purposes, I want to show you how to deal with passing bearer tokens too. So as the first step, let's navigate to the tokens tab. So let's click on the logo right here, settings, scroll down a bit to developer settings, click on the personal access tokens, tokens classic, and right here generate new token. We'll use the classic token. As a note, let's call it whatever. Expiration I will set to 30 days and I will not select any scope. So let me generate the token, and right now you can see the value right here. Please note it down because we will need this later. Of course, do not share this value with anyone. Regarding the scopes, if you don't know what scopes you will need, always follow the principle of lowest privilege. At the end of the day, we can generate a new token at some point in the future when the requirements change. Excellent. As the next step, let's prepare a simple project responsible for querying the GitHub API. Long story short, we'll implement web client with coroutines that will query the list repositories for user endpoint. Let's check out the GitHub API documentation for more details. doc.github.com, and right here in the search bar, let's search for list repositories for a user. List repositories for a user. Let's hit enter and let's click on the first one. Wonderful. Now Ctrl+F, list repositories for a user. So right here we can see the endpoint that we are about to query. If you are interested in more details, you can find them right here. Anyway, let's generate a new project, Spring Boot project. So in order to do that, let's navigate to start.spring.io page. Start Spring.io. Wonderful. And on this page, this will be a Kotlin project, of course. So let's select this one right here. Language will be Kotlin. Spring Boot version will go with 3.2.4. When it comes to the group, I will change to com.coderc web client integration testing. For example, you can put whatever you want right here. Description, let's leave it as it is. Packaging will be jar, and Java version, let's go with 17. Lastly, let's add the dependency. We'll add Spring Reactive Web that will need to work with coroutines I mentioned in the beginning. Spring Reactive Web. Wonderful. Let's hit generate, and the zip package will be downloaded, which right now we would like to extract. Let's navigate to the folder. Excellent. Let's click right mouse button, extract all, extract. Wonderful. And as the next step, let's open up our favorite IDE. I will be using IntelliJ IDEA Community Edition. So let me search for IntelliJ IDEA. And right here, I will have a chance to open up the project. Let's hit open, downloads. Let me refresh that actually. Web client integration testing. Let's click on the folder with this black icon. Let me hit OK. And IntelliJ will open up the project. Right now, the project will sync. Gradle will try to fetch the necessary dependencies. Right here in the bottom, we can see the progress bar. If everything finishes successfully, we will proceed. So when the project is synced successfully, let's navigate to the main, Kotlin, and let's open up the web client integration testing application. Let's run it to verify that this is working fine. Wonderful. We can see right here that the application started and net is started on port 8080, which is the default one. Wonderful. Let's click this one. Let's stop the application. And as the next step, let's navigate to the resources. And let's convert the application properties into the YAML. This is my personal preference. Instead of working with the properties file, I prefer YAML files. Firstly, let's convert this one to the YAML. Spring application name. And right now, we'll add three properties for GitHub key, URL, and version. API, GitHub key, URL, and version. For all of these values, I would like them to be sourced from environment variable, and we'll provide a default value. So let's start with key, and let's call it, for example, GitHub API token. GitHub API token, and the default value 123. Similarly for URL, GitHub API base URL, and I'll default that to localhost 8090 HTTP localhost port 8090. Lastly, let's provide the version for GitHub API, GitHub API version, and the default value I would like to be 28th of November of 2022. 2022, November 28th. Wonderful. So basically this approach is not only secure, because hard coding the key with token value would be the worst thing we could possibly do, but also flexible. We can pass different values depending on the environment that we are running our app in, whether this will be tests, UAT, or production. We can provide that as environment variables. Wonderful. Following, let's configure a web client bean that we'll use whenever we want to call the GitHub API. So let's add the config package. Let's click right here, right mouse button, new package called config. Again, right mouse button on the config package, new Kotlin class, and let's call it GitHub API properties. GitHub Hub API properties. Wonderful. And let's annotate this class with configuration properties annotation. Configuration properties. And right here, we'll provide the path that we would like to reference in the application YAML. In my opinion, this is the cleanest way to inject values from properties, and as we can see above, we simply provide the prefix and field names simply will be later mapped to the particular fields. Nevertheless, the next thing we need to do, let's convert that to Kotlin data class, and let's provide the names for properties. Val URL, string value, key will be the string value as well, and version will be string value too. So again, we can see that this will be mapped to the values from our API, from our application YAML file. As the next step, let's add the GitHub API config class. Config, right mouse button, Kotlin class, GitHub API config class. Let's annotate that with configuration first. And secondly, let's enable configuration properties so that our previous class will be working. Enable configuration properties, and we need to provide the name of our class. So GitHub API properties class. Excellent. Next, let's introduce the web client bean. So firstly, let's use the bean annotation and let's add a new function called WebClient. This one will take one parameter, builder, and this will be WebClient.builder type. Let's import, Alt plus Enter, let's import the class, and I would like this function to return a WebClient instance. WebClient instance. As the next step, equals, Ctrl Alt plus L to format the code, and nextly we would like to instantiate our web client. So I would like to provide the base URL from GitHub API properties, so we'll need to inject them. Let's add a constructor, private vol GitHub API properties. This way we'll inject those values, we'll be able to reference them. So builder dot base URL. As a base URL, let's provide the value from the properties dot URL. Nextly, we'll add the authorization header. We'll pass the bearer token, and again, this value will be sourced from the properties as well. Default header. The header name will be authorization, and the value will be bearer. And right now, let's use string interpolation and access the value from GitHub API properties. We'll use the key. Nextly, I would like to provide the API version. Default header x GitHub API version, and as the version, GitHub API properties dot version. Lastly, let's add the accept headers, and we'll provide the default headers accept and application / vnd GitHub plus JSON. And if you see this value for the first time, don't worry, this is the custom GitHub accept header. Lastly, we need to hit build.build, and right now the code will compile. Ctrl Alt plus L to format the code, and basically we can see that those headers will be added to every request we'll be making to using this web client. So thanks to that, later we don't need to provide this every time we are using web client. Excellent. With that done, let's prepare a bunch of data classes that will need to deserialize JSON responses from the API plus one exception class. Of course, if you would like to add other fields, please check out the documentation link that I will share with you in the description for this video. So again, as the first step, let's add a new package, and let's call it model. Following, let's add the pageable GitHub response. Right mouse button, new, Kotlin class, and right here, let's use the data class this time so that later we don't need to convert that. Pageable GitHub response. Wonderful. And I would like this one to take generic. So basically the API endpoints allow us to get only a chunk of data using the page and per page parameters, and thanks to this class we'll be able to wrap the response. So we need two fields. The first one, items, val items, and this will be a list of the type T. The second one will be a boolean flag, has more items, that will populate with information whether there are more items or not. Val has more items, and this will be a boolean. Sorry, items. Let me fix the typo right now. Wonderful. Following, let's implement the GitHub repo response along with GitHub owner response. So again, new Kotlin class, data class, GitHub repo response. Wonderful. And let's add three fields: fork, name and owner. Val fork will be a boolean value, name will be a string value, and owner will be of type GitHub owner response. GitHub owner response. Of course, we need to add this class. Pro tip, Alt plus Enter, and right here we can create a class. Let's keep it in this the same file, GitHub owner response. Nevertheless, we need to convert that to data class. For the owner, I would like to know the login of the particular owner. Val login, and this will be a string value. Lastly, let's add the upstream API exception. This way we'll be able to throw custom exceptions, and such an exception could be handled later, for example with REST controller advice. And if you'd like to learn how to use REST controller advice, then I highly encourage you to check out my blog. Right mouse button, new, Kotlin class, and this data class will be called upstream API exception. Upstream API exception. And this will have two fields. The first will be message, MSG in shortcut, and the second one will be status code of type HTTP status code. So val MSG of string, val status code HTTP status code. Wonderful. I would like this class to extend runtime exception so that this will be exception. Runtime exception from Kotlin, and this will be MSG. Ctrl Alt plus L to format the code. Wonderful. So finally, let's combine all of that together and let's introduce the GitHub API class responsible for querying the API. Let's click on the package, new package, and call it the API. Again, right mouse button, new Kotlin class, GitHub API. I would like this to be a Spring component, so I'll annotate that as a component with component annotation. Nextly, I would like to inject the web client that we'll use to query the API. So private val web client of type web client. Wonderful. So in our case, we have only one web client being in our project. Usually, in most of the production-ready projects, we'll have multiple ones. So we'll use, for example, resource annotation or qualifier to identify which web client we would like to use, or binding bar name, whatever. Following, let's add a new function, list repositories by username. And this will be a suspend function because, as I mentioned, we will be using Kotlin coroutines. Suspend function, list repositories by username. I would like this function to have 3 parameters, the username of string type, page, and per page, so that we'll be able to provide these values to the GitHub API. Username, string type, page of int type, per page, again int type. And as a result, we'll return pageable GitHub response. Pageable GitHub response. And this was a generic, so we'll provide GitHub response. GitHub response type. Wonderful. Equals, and right now we would like to fetch the data from the endpoint. So let's get back to the documentation. This is /users/usernames/repos. Let's get back to IntelliJ. First of all, let's invoke the get method, WebClient.get method. Nextly, let's provide the URI, and I would like to provide that as a string value, /users/ we need to provide the username, so again, string interpolation, /repos. So at this point, we would use the default page and per page values, and I would like to make that specific. So first, query parameter, page, equals, and let's specify the page, and to provide another query parameter, underscore page, equals, and let's provide the value, per page. Lastly, await the exchange or null, and I would like to introduce a new function, map to pageable response, and as an argument, provide to it the client response. So map to pageable response, and let's forward it. Alt plus enter to introduce the function, and let's create the function. We'll implement this in a moment, but in the meantime, let's summarize. We make this function a suspend function because await exchange or null is a suspend function too. I can hit Ctrl, keep it pressed, and click left mouse button on the function to see that right here, this is a suspend function too. If you would like to learn more about that, I have a separate video in which I am explaining how to use web client with coroutines. Nevertheless, let's add the missing code. So I would like this function to, first of all, be suspend to, be inlined, in order to access the type T. So private suspend inline fun, and I would like this to reified T. As a response, I would like to return the pageable GitHub response of type T. Pageable GitHub response of type T, and this will be nullable. Wonderful. Right now we can see that the code is compiling, so not that bad. Nextly, let's rename the parameter here, the argument client response. Wonderful. And as the first step, I would like to check if there are more pages to fetch. How we can do that? So let's get back to the documentation. Actually, let's search for pagination, hit enter, and there is this article using pagination in the REST API. I highly encourage you to check out it, but long story short, GitHub API returns the link header. And if its value contains the rel equals next, it means that there are more pages to fetch, and we'll use this property in our codebase. So let me get back to IntelliJ and we'll see that in action. So as I mentioned, first thing, client response dot headers. In order to read the headers, let's search for the link header. Link. Nextly, first or null contains next as a false. Alt plus enter, introduce local variable, and I will call it has more pages to fetch. Has more pages to fetch. Moreover, we can enclose that, Ctrl plus Alt plus M, and extract that to a separate function. check if more pages to fetch. Wonderful. We can click on that. Alt plus enter, specify the return type explicitly. I know that this is optional, but that's how I usually proceed. Okay, so has more pages to fetch. As you might have guessed, we'll use that in our pageable GitHub response to indicate that there are more items. Nextly, let's process the response. So I would like to return, and right now let's add when val status code. Let's read the status code client response dot status code. Let's open up the brackets. So if this is okay, I would like to deserialize the JSON payload to the body, to the list. So in our case, we would like to do that to GitHub repo response. Anyway, let's keep this function as generic as possible. So http status dot okay. If that's the case, let's return pageable GitHub response with items equals client response dot await body, and we need to provide the type list of type T. Wonderful. Has more items. Let's has more pages to fetch. One of other status codes that we can get will be 404 not found, and in this case I would like to convert that to simply null because we are returning a nullable type from our function. So http status dot not found, and if this is the case I would like to return null. And otherwise, if we are getting any other code, any 500 or something like that, let's go with else throw upstream API exception, and as a message I will provide GitHub API request failed, msg GitHub API request failed. Let's add a dot, colon, and let's provide the status code as the status code. Excellent. As an Easter egg, I would like to show you how we can use the reference instead. So this is a syntactic sugar that we can use right here. At this point, we have almost everything we need to test our web client implementation with WireMock. Right now, we have the GitHub API and the function that will be responsible for calling the GitHub endpoint. So I would like to show you only a few example test cases that you will be able to easily adapt according to your needs. So we'll implement 200 OK response with an empty list, 200 OK with items and more pages, and 200 OK with items and no more pages to fetch. Apart from that, 404 not found and 401 unauthorized. When you will be implementing your own integration test, this is the moment when you should do the homework and analyze the API you are working with. So, what are the possible happy paths? How should your code behave in case of any error status code? What if we add some latency? And many more cases that you can figure out. As the next step, we need to add the necessary dependencies. We need WireMock and Kotlin X coroutines for tests. So let's open up our browser once again and let's navigate to Maven repository. mavenrepository.com, and let's search for contract WireMock. Spring Cloud contract WireMock. Let's hit enter. This is that one that we're looking for. I'll use 3.1.2. Let's specify the Gradle Kotlin, Ctrl+C, and let's get back to IntelliJ. Build Gradle, and I will add this right here as the test implementation. Test implementation 2. Wonderful. Let's get back to the Maven repository and let's search for Kotlin X coroutines test. Coroutines test. This one, org.jetbrains.kotlinx. and let's use the 1.8.0 Ctrl+C IntelliJ. Again, we need that for test implementation. Following, let's hit this icon right here to sync the project. If this does not pop up in your case, you can click always on Gradle and use this icon to reload all Gradle projects. So when all of the necessary dependencies are fetched, we can add the expected JSON files. So personally, whenever working with WireMock, I am a big fan of externalizing the expected JSON files. So simply we put them inside the test resources. Test. We don't have something like that, so we can click new directory, and we can see right here that this is already provided. Let's hit enter, and we can see that we have the test resources. How can we fetch them? Well, in this case, I will use the ones that I have already in my GitHub repository. However, in real life scenario, I encourage you to simply query the API and see what are the different cases that you can encounter, because this will be the closest to a real life scenario and we would like to go for that. Nevertheless, before fetching them, let's add a new packages in the resources, new directory, let's call it responses, new directory again, external, and lastly GitHub, new directory, GitHub. Wonderful. Following, let me navigate to my GitHub page. Let me find the integration testing, src, tests, resources. Again, we can see resources, responses, external /GitHub. I will provide a link for this repository in the description for this video. So don't worry. Let's go for the first one. Right here we can download raw file. We have first one pager. Again, download the file. Let's do exactly the same for two remaining files. Wonderful. Now let's navigate to the directory where they were fetched. Ctrl+X to cut that. Let's navigate to IntelliJ and Ctrl+V right here. Let's hit OK, and we can see that all of these files has been added. Let's take a look, for example, at 401 unauthorized. We can see and right here we have message, blah blah blah, bad credentials, and the documentation URL. Wonderful. Before we start implementing test cases, I would like to prepare util function that we'll use to read JSON files inside the test resources as string values to our test cases. So let me click right here, new Kotlin class. This time I would like to go with Kotlin file and call it simply util. This will be test util. And let's add a new function called getResponseBody as string. Fun, getResponseBody as string. And I would like this function to take one parameter, path, of string type, and this will be returning a string value with our decoded JSON. Next, let's use class path resource path dot get content as string, and I would like to provide charset dot utf8. Excellent. Ctrl+Alt+L. With all of that done, let's start implementing the GitHubApi test class. So you can do that manually, or alternatively, you can go to GitHubApi, click on the class name, Alt+Enter. This is the shortcut that allows you to do a lot of things in IntelliJ IDEA, and hit create test right here. The pop-up window will allow you to specify the class name and things like that. Let's call it the GitHubApi test as the default one. The first thing I would like to do will be to introduce three constants: the test key, test port, and test version that we'll use in our case. Private const val test key equals test key, Ctrl plus D to duplicate, and the next value will be test port 8082, Ctrl plus D, test version 2022 11/2011. Wonderful. As the next step, let's add the Spring Boot test annotation. Spring Boot test annotation, and let's specify the web environment Spring Boot test dot web environment dot random port. So basically we use this annotation for Spring Boot integration tests, and this way a new application context will be created. In our case, we set the web environment with a random port value so that a reactive context listening on the random port is created. Nextly, let's add test property source. Test property source. And right here we can provide the properties as an array. Properties, array of string values, api.github.url. Remember that it must match the value from our application YAML file. And right now equals http://localhost, and the port will be test port. Let's add a colon, Ctrl plus D 2 times. First, I would like to add the key. The key will be nothing else than the test key. And similarly, the version will be the test version. Ctrl Alt L, wonderful. So as you can see, this is the way we can provide the values for application properties, provide the properties for our application context. Lastly, let's add the auto configure WireMock. Auto configure WireMock, and the port equals test port. So thanks to this one, the WireMock server will be started as a part of application context. Wonderful. So as the next step, let's inject the WireMock server, auto wired, private late init var WireMock server of type WireMock server. Nextly, let's inject the GitHub API. Auto wired again, private late init var GitHub API of type GitHub API. And you can see right now that we can do that just like we would inject a simple bin in our code base. Lastly, let's add three properties: the page, the per page, and some random username. So private val page first page, private val per page will be 2, and private val username equals UID, random UID, 2 strings. So simply every time the GitHub API test class is instantiated, the random username will be generated. So at this point we can start with the 404 not found case. So let's add a new test. I will use the given when name approach of naming. Test fun given 404 not found response when fetching repository by username, then should return null. Let's close that. Wonderful. And let's use the run test. Run test. Excellent, because we are dealing right now with coroutines. So at this point we can see that we simply annotate the test just like every JUnit test, and we use the run test. Long story short, on the JVM this will be working the same as the run blocking block. Nextly, let's add some stubbing for WireMock, which is nothing else than the ability to return canned HTTP response for request matching criteria. Simply said, whenever an outgoing request that matches our criteria is made, a mocked response configured with will return is returned. So let's start with given to clearly divide our code here. WireMock server, stub 4. And right now I would like to add a stub for the request to GitHubApi. And this was a get request. WireMock.get. And I would like this URL to be equal to particular URL. So WireMock.URL equal to, and right now we specify the URL, and this was /users username repos page equal to page and per page equal to per page. So we can see that with this line of code, let me close this sidebar, we can see that this line of code will match the stub for every request outgoing to the /users with the following parameters. Nextly, I would like this stub to work only for particular authorization header, API version, and the accept header. So with header authorization, let me double check authorization, okay, WireMock equal to, and the value, I would like this to be bearer test.key. Ctrl+D to duplicate, and let's match the another header x-github-api-version. I would like this one to be equals to test version. Ctrl+D, the accept header, and again this one will be equal to application/vnd GitHub plus JSON. So again, whenever a request to a particular URL, a GET request of course, Ctrl+Z, sorry, with these headers will be made, we would like to return a particular response. So right now, dot will return, and we'll build our response. WireMock dot response with status. I would like the status to be not found. HTTP status not found value with header content type dot with header HTTP headers dot content type application JSON char set equals UTF.8. If you are wondering how did I figure out this header, well, basically from querying the API. As I mentioned previously, we want this to be as close to the real call as possible. And right now I would like to provide the body, so dot with body. And the body, right now, let's use the function that we implemented previously. So get response body as string, and we need to provide the path. So this will be done the easiest by simply going right here, and let's use this one, copy path reference, and right here we'll use this. Let me double check. However, we don't want the resources, so this will be responses, external GitHub, and we'll be navigating to our file. Wonderful. With that done, we can simply invoke when vol result equals GitHubApi list repositories by username, and we'll provide the username, the page, and the per page argument. Let me scroll down a bit. Then Ctrl-Alt-L maybe to format it in the meantime. And lastly, I would like to simply assert that the result is null because that's what we implemented previously. Assertions assert null result. Ctrl-Alt-L and let's run our test. And wonderful, we can see that our test passed. So let's rephrase what we learned right here. We can see that when working with WireMock, this is pretty similar to any other mocking library. We provide the conditions for which the mock should be created. So whenever we make a GET request to a matching URL with matching headers, the particular response will be returned. If any of these does not match, well, then the test will simply fail. So with all of that being done, we can basically copy this test and adjust that to another case. I would like to test 401 unauthorized, which should throw the upstream API exception. So let me copy all of that and let's change the name. Given 401 unauthorized, 401 unauthorized response, when fetching repository by username, then should throw upstream API exception. Then should throw upstream API exception. Again, we'll be running the test, we'll be stubbing, but this time the response will be slightly different. First of all, the status will be 401. So unauthorized. The header value will be exactly the same. However, this time we'll be referencing to other file. Let me copy the file name 401 unauthorized as I have shown previously, but credentials. Right here, I can copy the name with Ctrl+C and get back to the test and provide this value right here. Wonderful. This time, instead of result, I'm interested more in the exception itself. So instead of result, let's call it exception. GitHub API. Let's hit Ctrl+X to cut the value. And this time I would like to assert that it throws the upstream API exception. Assert throws upstream API exception. Upstream API exception. Let's open up brackets and invoke our function within it. So lastly, I would like to assert that this is not null. I would like to exception to be thrown. So assert not null, the exception. And lastly, let's simply assert the exception and the status code. So assert equals GitHub API request failed with dot exception dot message. Alt+Enter, and let's import the correct one from org.JUnit Jupyter API assertions. Ctrl+D, and exception status code needs to be equal to unauthorized. HTTP status from Spring Framework unauthorized. Ctrl+Alt+L. Now let's simply run this test. Wonderful. We can see again that this test passed. So this function is useful whenever you're working with any code that needs to throw the exception to not only assert that the particular exception is thrown, but also to get the object of that exception. With that done, let's verify that we can get 200 OK with empty list. So again, simply copy paste or Ctrl+D to make this easier. And now given 200 OK response, 200 OK response, when fetching repository by username, then should return repository with correct properties and has next set to false. So let's write this explicitly. Then should return repository with correct properties and has next set to false. This time, whenever we are getting this URL, we would like to return status code OK, 200 OK, the same header, and this time the response body string will be 200 OK empty list. Let's be cautious about that. Wonderful. And the gal will be reading the response instead of exceptions. So let me delete all of these. Val result equals GitHub API list repositories username page and per page. And lastly, I would like to assert the expected pageable GitHub response is returned. So vol expected equals pageable GitHub response. The items will be simply an empty list of GitHub repo response, empty list of type GitHub repo response, and has more will be set to false. Lastly, assert equals expected and the result. Ctrl-Alt-L to format the code, and let's run this test. As the next test case, let's figure out the 200 OK with has next true. So let me copy this, Ctrl+D, let's hit enter, give it 200 OK response when fetching repository by username, then should return repository with correct properties and has next set to true instead of false. And in order to fulfill that, well, we need to add the link header. So I'll do that manually, but in general, you can copy that from and the response from GitHub. Val link header value equals, and let's use that. https://api github.com/user/some id/repos page, for example 1, and per page equals 2, rel equals next. Wonderful. Let me close that in the meantime. Basically, again, this is the copied value that I saw, but technically to test that case, you could simply use the next or put that in whatever. Again, I want this to be as close to the real cases as possible. So right now, our response will return the OK value, will return the content type, but additionally, it will return the link header with the value equal to link header value, and this time we will get response body as string from page 1. Let me copy that, remove the JSON, list GitHub blah blah blah, page 1 JSON, and this time this will not be the empty list, so I need to simply provide the list of GitHub repo response, list of, and basically this will be based on our JSON. So GitHub response fork equals to false, name. Let's go and fetch the first name from this file. You can hit Ctrl and keep it pressed, left mouse button, and you will be navigated right here. To make your life easier, simply copy this value. Name. We should expect this name. Owner will be GitHub owner response. Login. And let's get back to this file. We can see the owner. We can see the login. So I'll copy this value. And that's all for the first thing. In this list, we have two things. This one and this one. So we can see two things. Ctrl plus D, enter. Let's check. Again, name. Let's copy it here, and the login will be exactly the same. Let me check whether this is fork false, and yeah, this is fork false. Set to false. 2 for has more items. Let's use true, and this time assert equals expected equals. Wonderful. Let's hit run. Excellent. The last case we can check will be simply the same check, but with has next set to false. So this will be the case when we are fetching some results, non-empty list, and there are no other items. So simply set, let's copy Ctrl plus C, Ctrl plus V, and we can see that there is a clash. So let me check. Then should return repository with items, correct properties, and has next set to false. The rel cannot be next. This will be priv in real life scenarios. Let me go right here, get to false, and hit run. Wonderful. We can see that all tests are passing successfully. And basically that's all for this video on how to perform integration testing for Spring WebClient with WireMock and JUnit 5. I hope you really enjoyed this one, and I would like to invite you to my other videos on my channel related to Kotlin on the backend. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.